Incidental Language Learning, Listening and Learning Out of the Corner of Your Ear by Saffran and colleagues. From the time they are born, children are immediately exposed to a variety of sensory stimuli from which they gradually extract and acquire language as they grow older. This article focuses on the mechanisms by which they do that, more specifically, the mechanism of incidental learning. Traditionally, language acquisition was considered independent of other learning mechanisms. These other learning mechanisms include implicit processing and frequency estimation. The frequency of events that occur in the environment is one of the basic forms of information that get encoded in our memory implicitly. And speaking of implicitly, implicit learning allows us to gain abstract information without being consciously aware of it. Both of these concepts show age invariance in the sense that school-age kids perform just as well as adults, unlike in other processes of developmental psychology which show an improvement in performance with age. Both of these concepts also rely on the statistical structure of incoming information. So how does language acquisition fit in? Well, infants gain so much input during the first year. Studies have shown that they can successfully segment words by the age of 8 months, which is before they can even start producing speech. But they aren't making any conscious or intentional effort to learn language, which means that the process is implicit, and it is suggested that infants use statistical learning to segment these words. Contradictory to the traditional views of language acquisition, recent findings show that it shares common features with these other learning mechanisms. The aim of the study was to try and support these findings by showing that the first stages of language development do involve incidental learning, show age invariance, and use statistical computations. In their study, they took 13 school-aged children and 12 undergrads who were all monolingual English speakers and asked them to create illustrations on a computer while an audio tape played in the background. The audio consisted of 6 trisyllabic fake words repeated in random order with no pauses in between. After 21 minutes of exposure, 6 non-word foils were paired with the 6 original words in a forced choice trial. The subjects were then asked to indicate which sets of sounds seemed familiar from the tape that was playing in the background during the activity they performed. Both groups performed better than they would if they had just been guessing, which showed evidence of learning, even though they had not been told that they would be tested or that the audio consisted of a language, albeit a novel one. The adults on average scored 21.1 out of 36, while the school-aged kids got an average score of 21.3 out of 36. This is much higher than the chance score of 18 out of 36. There was no significant difference between the scores of the two groups. The researchers were then interested in seeing if increasing the exposure time would affect performance, so they conducted the same procedure, but this time had 2 sessions on subsequent days, and subjects were not tested at the end of the first day. What they found was that doubling the exposure time resulted in significant improvement in both age groups. This time, both groups performed even better on the forced choice test, with adults getting a mean score of 26.3 out of 36, and kids getting a mean score of 24.6 out of 36. The difference between the two groups was once again not significant. So what do these results mean? Well, firstly, it supports the idea that language acquisition can be done via computation of transitional properties. Also, it supports the idea that language can be attained via incidental learning because the subjects in this case were not told to listen to or learn from the audio. In addition to this, the longer the exposure to the input, the greater the participants' performance were. Lastly, it shows age invariance in the sense that children perform just as well as adults. We know, however, that individuals cannot learn language with as much proficiency once they pass the critical period. The age invariance in this study implies that the effects of critical period occur at the later stages of learning and affect more complex language features such as possibly syntactic structure instead of word segmentation as exhibited here. This is supported by other literature as well that states that basic word order can be acquired at pretty much any age. This also suggests that the computation of some linguistic input is done equally well by those with arguably lower cognitive ability, such as kids. And this study proves that language learning shares certain features with other learning mechanisms, therefore implying that language acquisition has much to do with identifying and internalizing general statistical patterns, such as in other forms of learning, and isn't specifically a linguistic ability. Even though the language input in this lab setting was much more isolated than it would be in a natural environment where there is a multitude of other sights and sounds, the input itself was also much more impoverished than it would be in natural speech, where utterance, boundaries, and prosodic cues are used. It is also interesting to see an implication for second language learning. This suggests that you don't necessarily have to be taking Spanish lessons to learn at least some lower level linguistic characteristics of it if you are routinely exposed to Spanish input. All in all, this experiment provides great insight into the incidental learning mechanisms of language acquisition.